The smell of industrial lemon cleaner and damp, recycled air was the scent of her evenings now. Ilara Vance pushed the heavy-duty cart along the polished corridor, its rubber wheels squeaking a rhythmic complaint against the marble. Outside the panoramic windows, the city glittered, a sprawling galaxy of indifferent lights. It was a view people paid millions for, but for her, it was just the backdrop to a life lived in the margins, cleaning up after the people who owned the view. Each swipe of her cloth across a glass partition, each empty wastebasket she lined with a fresh bag, was a small, necessary motion that kept her and her son afloat. It was temporary, she told herself, a mantra that had grown thin with use. The bookkeeping work she did during the day for the same cleaning company, North Star Janitorial, paid the rent on their small apartment, but it was the extra night shifts, covering for a sick colleague, that paid for things like Leo's field trips and the ever-present threat of a new cavity. Her son, Leo, was 7. He was the bright, warm center of her universe, a small planet of boundless energy and startlingly profound questions. Right now, he was with Mrs. Gable from next door, a woman whose kindness felt like a lifeline. He would be asleep, his small hand likely clutching the worn plush dinosaur she had won for him at a street fair 2 years ago. The thought of him, safe and dreaming, was the fuel that propelled her through the exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones. It was a weariness that wasn't just physical, it was the psychic weight of single-handedly steering their tiny ship through choppy financial waters, the lingering ghost of a marriage that had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, draining realization that she was doing it all alone anyway. Her ex-husband, Mark, was a charming silhouette, a man who promised foundations and delivered only sand. The debt he had left behind was a third resident in their 2-bedroom apartment, a silent, demanding guest. This floor was the top one. The Executive Suites. Croft Enterprises. The name was etched in brushed steel on the main glass doors. The offices here were different. The carpet was thicker, silencing her footsteps. The desks were vast expanses of dark, polished wood, almost entirely clear of clutter. It was a space that radiated power and a kind of sterile loneliness. Most nights, it was empty, a silent testament to deals made and battles won. But tonight, a single light burned from the corner office, a blade of gold slicing through the gloom. She hesitated, her hand resting on the cart's handle. Protocol was to skip occupied offices and return later. But it was late, almost the end of her shift, and the thought of circling back was draining. She decided to just empty the exterior wastebasket and clean the hallway glass, hoping whoever was inside wouldn't notice or care. As she worked, she could hear the faint, muffled cadence of a man's voice from within the office. It was a low, controlled rumble, sharp and clipped with authority. He was clearly on a call, and from the sound of it, not a pleasant one. She tried to be as quiet as possible, her movements practiced and efficient. She emptied the small bin by the door, her eyes catching on the nameplate beside it, Julian Croft, Chief Executive Officer. The man himself. The owner of the View. She had only ever seen his picture in the business section of the paper her boss sometimes left in the break room, a face with sharp angles, dark hair, and eyes that seemed to be assessing the camera for weaknesses. She was wiping down the final glass panel when something on the floor caught her eye. Tucked just under the lip of a low, modern leather couch in the reception area outside his office was a small, black notebook. It was Moleskine. She recognized the brand, the kind that serious people used for serious thoughts. It must have slipped from a pocket or a briefcase. Her first instinct was to leave it. It was not her business. But her own meticulous nature, the part of her that balanced ledgers to the penny and found a quiet satisfaction in order, rebelled. A lost thing felt like an unsolved problem. She picked it up. The leather was smooth and worn, the elastic band that held it shut stretched slightly from use. It felt personal, heavy with unspoken things. Leaving it for the morning crew felt wrong. What if it was important? What if it contained the kind of information that could make or break a company like this one? Her life was a testament to the devastating power of small, overlooked details. She took a breath, the lemon-scented air feeling thin in her lungs. She would knock. She would interrupt the powerful man on his powerful call and return his lost notebook. It was the right thing to do. It was that simple, and that terrifying. She walked to the heavy wooden door and raised her hand, her knuckles hovering just inches from the surface. This was the moment the gears of her carefully managed life began to shift, grinding against a future she could not possibly have imagined. Her knock was timid at first, barely a whisper against the solid oak. She waited, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Nothing. The rumbling voice inside continued, unabated. She knocked again, firmer this time, the sound echoing slightly in the empty corridor. The voice inside stopped abruptly. A moment of charged silence, then the sound of a heavy chair scraping against the floor. The door swung open. Julian Croft was taller than his newspaper photograph suggested, and the intensity of his gaze was far more potent in person. He filled the doorway, his white shirt crisp despite the late hour, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. His tie was loosened, and a faint shadow of stubble darkened his jaw. He looked tired, annoyed, and profoundly impatient. His eyes, a shade of dark, serious gray, swept over her uniform, dismissing her before he even spoke. He held a phone to his ear. "I have to call you back," he said into it, his voice low and tight with controlled frustration. He ended the call without a goodbye and focused his full, formidable attention on her. Yes. The single word was not a question so much as a demand for justification. Ilara felt herself shrink a little under his stare. She held up the notebook, the object feeling small and foolish in her hand now. "I found this," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "On the floor, by the couch. I thought it might be important." He looked from her face to the notebook. His expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable, surprise, perhaps, or relief, before the mask of command settled back into place. He took it from her, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief, impersonal, but it sent a strange, unexpected jolt through her. He flipped it open, glanced at a page, and then snapped it shut. "Thank you," he said, the words clipped, efficient. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, folded money clip. He extracted several large bills without looking at them. "Here. For your trouble." It was not a reward, it was a transaction. A dismissal. It was the same gesture one might use to tip a valet or a bellhop, an automatic reflex of the wealthy to smooth over minor inconveniences with cash. And in that moment, something inside her, a quiet, resilient core of self-respect she had fought hard to protect, bristled. She looked at the money he was holding out, then back at his face. "No, thank you, Mr. Croft. I was just doing my job." He paused, his hand still extended. His eyes narrowed slightly, truly seeing her for the first time. Not the uniform, but the woman wearing it. He saw the faint lines of fatigue around her eyes, the set of her jaw that spoke of determination, the unwavering clarity in her gaze. "Everyone has a price," he said, and it was not a philosophical statement. It was a fact of his world, a fundamental law of his universe. It was the kind of careless, cynical remark born of a life surrounded by people who could always be bought. A flicker of dry wit, the kind she usually reserved for her own internal monologue, escaped. "Well, my price for returning a lost notebook is a simple thank you. It looks like you're overpaying." She hadn't meant to say it. The words just came out, polished by exhaustion and a sudden, reckless need to be seen as more than an anonymous cleaner. A slow smile touched his lips, a genuine, startling expression that briefly erased the weariness from his face. It changed everything about him. He looked younger, less formidable. He slowly withdrew his hand and slid the money back into his clip. "My apologies," he said, and the words sounded sincere. "You're right. Thank you." He looked at her again, a long, appraising look that was no longer dismissive. He was assessing her, trying to solve the puzzle of the cleaning woman who turned down a few $100s. "What's your name?" "Ilara," she said, her voice a little breathless now. "Ilara Vance." "Ilara Vance," he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. He nodded slowly. "Well, Ilara Vance. You've managed to be the most interesting part of a very tedious day." He leaned against the doorframe, a gesture that was surprisingly casual, disarming. He seemed in no hurry for her to leave. She, on the other hand, felt an urgent need to retreat to the familiar anonymity of her cart and her duties. The intensity of his focus was like a spotlight, and she was used to living in the shadows. She gave a small, polite nod. "I should get back to my work." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "The numbers," he said, almost to himself. He was looking at the notebook in his hand, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. She turned back. "I'm sorry." He looked up, his gray eyes locking onto hers again. It's just, you do this every night. Tidy up chaos. It was an odd question. I suppose so. That's the job. It must be satisfying, he mused, a strange, melancholic note in his voice. To take a disordered space and make it clean. To have clear lines, a finished result. He gestured vaguely back into his office, a landscape of spreadsheets and legal documents visible on multiple glowing monitors. My work is just rearranging chaos into a different, more complicated kind of chaos. Ilara thought of her bookkeeping ledgers, the neat columns, the perfect balance of debits and credits. She understood exactly what he meant. There was a profound peace in things that added up correctly. She found herself admitting, I do bookkeeping during the day. For the same company. I prefer it. There's a right answer. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. A bookkeeper. That made more sense to him, she could see it in his expression. The principled refusal of money, the quiet dignity, it clicked into place for him. He saw her now not as a cleaner, but as a person with a different, underleveraged skill set. This new information settled between them, altering the dynamic of their strange, late-night encounter. He was no longer just a powerful CEO, and she was no longer just the invisible woman who cleaned his office. They were two people, awake late at night, surrounded by the silent city, talking about the elusive comfort of order in a chaotic world. He didn't forget her. Ilara assumed he would, that their brief interaction would dissolve into the countless other moments of his high-powered life. She went back to her routine, the days of balancing accounts for North Star Janitorial and the nights of wrestling with her own precarious budget. The memory of their conversation in the hushed, expensive corridor felt like a scene from a movie she had once watched, strangely vivid but disconnected from her reality. She pushed it away, filing it under odd encounters, and focused on the tangible, packing Leo's lunch, chasing down late payments from clients, trying to find a coupon for a new pair of sneakers because Leo's toes were pushing through the front of his old ones. Then, a week later, her supervisor, a kind but perpetually flustered man named David, called her into his small, cluttered office. He looked nervous, fidgeting with a pen. Mr. Croft's office called, he said, avoiding her eyes. They asked for you. Specifically. They have a proposition. Ilara's stomach tightened. A proposition? What kind of proposition? Her mind raced through a dozen unpleasant scenarios, the cynicism she had cultivated as a defense mechanism kicking into high gear. This is how it started, she thought, the uncomfortable abuses of power she had read about. David cleared his throat, finally meeting her gaze. It's a job. A temporary contract. He wants you to review some financial documents for him. He said he was impressed with your integrity. And your background in bookkeeping. He slid a crisp folder across the desk. They sent this over by courier. It's a formal offer. She opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a letter on thick, cream-colored stationery bearing the Croft Enterprises letterhead. It was a short-term contract for an independent financial auditor. The scope of the work was vague, reviewing preliminary accounting records for a recent acquisition, but the compensation listed at the bottom made her draw in a sharp breath. It was more than she made in 6 months. It was enough to clear the most pressing of Mark's debts, to start a college fund for Leo, to fix the rattling noise in her old car. It was an impossible number. It was a lifeline. And she didn't trust it for a second. Why me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He has an entire army of accountants. People with advanced degrees and years of experience at top firms. David shrugged, looking as bewildered as she felt. I don't know, Ilara. His assistant just said he insisted. He wants someone from the outside, someone with no skin in the game, she said. He wants you to start tomorrow. He's already arranged with me for you to take a paid leave of absence from your duties here. A paid leave of absence. He had thought of everything. He had smoothed the path so completely that all she had to do was say yes. It felt less like an offer and more like a summons. The efficiency of it was both impressive and deeply unsettling. People like Julian Croft didn't do things without a reason, and she couldn't fathom what his reason could possibly be. Was this some kind of elaborate test? A game? Or worse, was it a form of charity dressed up as a job, a way for him to finally give her the money she had refused, but on his own terms. The thought stung her pride. That evening, she sat at her small kitchen table long after Leo was asleep, the contract lying in front of her like a dare. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. She traced the embossed logo of Croft Enterprises with her finger. Skepticism warred with a desperate, burgeoning hope. Her life was a careful, exhausting balancing act. She had built a wall of self-sufficiency around herself and Leo, a fortress made of meticulous budgets and unwavering principle. This offer was a Trojan horse at the gates of that fortress. Accepting it meant letting someone in. It meant being vulnerable, relying on the inexplicable whim of a powerful stranger. But what was the alternative? To keep struggling, to let her pride stand in the way of a chance to give her son a better, more secure life. She thought of Leo's face, the way he had looked at a shiny new science kit in a store window last week, his eyes full of longing before he had quietly said, "Maybe for my birthday." The memory was a sharp pang in her chest. This wasn't just about her. She picked up a pen. Her hand was steady. She signed her name, the ink a stark, definitive black against the cream paper. It was a leap of faith into a world she did not understand, a world of wealth and power that operated by rules she had never learned. But as she sealed the envelope, a small, unfamiliar feeling fluttered within her. It was not just fear or suspicion. It was a flicker of excitement, the thrill of stepping off a well-worn path into the unknown. She was working on it, this business of learning to trust. Maybe this was the first real step. The next morning, she walked into the Croft Enterprises building not through the service entrance, but through the main lobby. The soaring atrium, the hushed efficiency of the people striding past with briefcases and purpose, the sheer scale of the place, it was all designed to intimidate. She wore her best blouse and a pair of black slacks, an outfit that felt like a costume. A polite but firm security guard directed her to the top floor, where a woman with a sleek blonde bob and an unnervingly perfect smile greeted her. Julian's assistant, a woman named Chloe. Chloe led her to a small, glass-walled office not far from Julian's own. It was empty except for a desk, a comfortable-looking chair, and a large monitor. On the desk was a stack of file boxes and a brand-new laptop. "Mr. Croft asked me to get you set up with everything you'll need," Chloe said, her tone professionally cheerful but her eyes giving away a hint of curiosity. "He's in meetings all morning, but he left instructions. The files in the boxes need to be cross-referenced with the digital records on the server. He wants you to look for inconsistencies." Inconsistencies. The word was deliberately vague. Ilara sat down at the desk, the leather of the chair cool against her back. The scale of the task was daunting. The boxes were filled with invoices, expense reports, and payroll records from a company called Aerodyne, the recent acquisition. It was a mountain of data. For the first few hours, she felt a profound sense of imposter syndrome. The numbers swam before her eyes. The corporate jargon was a foreign language. She was a cleaner, a small-time bookkeeper, playing dress-up in a world of high finance. But then, she started to work. She pushed aside the anxiety and focused on the familiar, comforting ritual of her profession. She opened a spreadsheet, created columns, and began the slow, methodical process of data entry. One by one, she translated the paper chaos into digital order. And as she did, the fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet, absorbing focus. This, she knew how to do. This was her language. The numbers didn't care that she had cleaned floors the night before. They simply were what they were, waiting for someone to put them in their proper place. Julian did not appear until late in the afternoon. She heard his voice first, a low murmur from the hallway, and then he was standing in her doorway. He had shed his suit jacket and his tie, and he held 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He placed one on her desk without a word. "Finding everything you need?" he asked, his voice softer than she remembered. She nodded, gesturing to the screen filled with neat rows and columns. "It's a lot of data. But I'm making progress." He leaned against the doorframe, just as he had before, and sipped his coffee. He watched her screen for a moment. "Chloe said you've been here since 8 and haven't taken a break." "When I get into a set of books, I tend to lose track of time," she admitted, a small smile touching her lips. He returned the smile. "I was hoping you would." He was quiet for a long moment, simply watching her, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was companionable. In this small, shared moment, they were not a CEO and a contractor. They were just two people who found solace in order. She noticed the way he held his mug, with both hands, as if warming them, though the office was not cold. It was a small, vulnerable gesture that seemed at odds with his powerful persona. "My son, Leo, he loves puzzles," she found herself saying, the words surprising her as much as they might have him. "Jigsaw puzzles. The bigger, the better. He can spend hours just sitting on the floor, sorting pieces by color and shape. He says it's like finding a secret story. One piece at a time." Julian's gaze was thoughtful. "He sounds like a smart kid." "He is," she said, a wave of warmth and pride washing over her. "He's the best thing in my world." The admission hung in the air, deeply personal and utterly sincere. She had revealed a piece of her heart to him, and he received it with a quiet respect. He didn't offer platitudes or change the subject. He just nodded, a flicker of something that looked like longing in his eyes. "I had a dog once," he said, his voice quiet. "A golden retriever named Sam. He thought the whole world was a conspiracy to make him happy. It was a good way to live." The revelation was so unexpected, so endearingly melancholic, that Elara laughed. It was a real, unburdened sound, and it seemed to surprise them both. In that moment, the last of her suspicion about his motives began to melt away. This wasn't charity. This wasn't a game. He was lonely. The man who owned the View, who commanded a corporate empire, was profoundly, achingly lonely. And for some reason, he had decided to share a small piece of that loneliness with her. The connection between them deepened in that quiet office, not through grand declarations, but through the shared, understated language of puzzles and memories of a happy dog. The days settled into a new rhythm. Elara would arrive early, letting the quiet of the morning office settle around her as she dove into the Aerodyne files. Leo was in a summer day camp, a good one she could now afford, and the relief of knowing he was happy and cared for was a balm on her soul. She worked with a singular focus, her mind sharp and clear. The work was a refuge, a place where her skills were not just valued, but essential. She was no longer just making ends meet, she was solving a complex problem, and she was good at it. Julian kept a respectful distance, never hovering or micromanaging. But he found reasons to interact with her. A cup of coffee in the morning. A brief question about her progress in the afternoon. Sometimes he would just stand in her doorway for a few minutes, watching her work in a comfortable silence before moving on. These small, private interactions began to feel like the new normal. She learned the subtle cues of his moods. The tight set of his jaw meant a deal was going south, a slight, almost imperceptible relaxing of his shoulders meant a crisis had been averted. She, in turn, felt herself slowly lowering her own defenses. She told him about Leo's latest obsession with astronomy, about the leaky faucet in her apartment she had finally learned to fix herself. He listened, truly listened, with an attentiveness that made her feel seen and heard in a way she hadn't been in years. One evening, she stayed late, determined to finish reconciling a particularly troublesome quarter. The rest of the office had long since emptied out, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the servers and the clicking of her keyboard. She was so absorbed she didn't notice Julian until he was standing beside her desk, holding 2 takeout containers. "You'll work yourself into the ground if you're not careful," he said, his tone gentle. "I thought you might be hungry." The smell of roasted chicken and garlic filled the small office, and her stomach rumbled in response. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. "Thank you," she said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he said simply. He pulled up a chair and they ate in a companionable silence, the city lights beginning to bloom in the twilight outside the window. "Why did you really hire me, Julian?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. It was too direct, too personal, but the comfortable quiet of the evening had emboldened her. He put down his fork and looked at her, his expression serious. "The night we met," he began, "you did something no one in my world does. You refused money you could have easily taken. You chose your own integrity over a simple transaction. I'm surrounded by people who are constantly calculating, constantly assessing what they can get from me. It's exhausting." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The Aerodyne acquisition was my project. I pushed for it, hard. And now, something about the numbers feels wrong. The profits they reported, the growth, it all seems too perfect. I needed someone to look at it with fresh eyes. Someone I knew I could trust. Someone whose only agenda was to find the right answer. The confession was a revelation. It laid bare his own vulnerability, his isolation at the top. He was surrounded by yes-men and opportunists, and in a world of shifting allegiances, her simple, unbuyable honesty had shone like a beacon. He hadn't hired her out of pity, he had hired her because he was in trouble, and he had recognized in her a strength and a principle that he desperately needed. The power dynamic between them, which had once seemed so vast and insurmountable, suddenly felt equalized. He had wealth and influence, but she had something he valued even more, an unwavering moral compass. "I was betrayed, once," he said, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear him. "My first business partner. A friend I had known since college. He nearly bankrupted the company, embezzling funds for years right under my nose. I trusted him completely. After that, I found it hard to trust anyone." The story explained so much: his initial cynicism, his guarded nature, his profound appreciation for her simple act of returning his notebook. He wasn't just a powerful CEO, he was a man who had been deeply wounded and was still carrying the scars. A wave of empathy washed over her, so strong it was almost painful. She understood the sting of misplaced trust, the way it could reshape a person's world into something sharp and unforgiving. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said, and the words were not a platitude. They were a genuine acknowledgement of his pain. He gave her a small, grateful smile. He stood up and took their empty containers. "Get some rest, Ilara. The numbers will still be here tomorrow." But as he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway. "Thank you," he said, "for listening." She watched him go, the broad line of his shoulders disappearing down the silent hall. She felt a shift deep inside her, a final crumbling of the walls she had so carefully constructed. She was beginning to care for this complicated, lonely man. And that realization was far more terrifying than any financial discrepancy she could ever uncover. It was a Tuesday afternoon when she found it. The inconsistency. It wasn't a single, glaring error, but a subtle, recurring pattern, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. It was hidden in the expense reports of Aerodyne's top 3 salesmen. They were small amounts at first: inflated mileage claims, duplicate receipts for meals, the kind of petty fraud that might slip past a cursory audit. But as Ilara dug deeper, tracing the patterns back over several years, she saw that the amounts were escalating. It was a slow, systematic bleed. She followed the trail with the grim determination of a bloodhound. The salesman's reports were all approved by the same person, Marcus Thorne, Aerodyne's vice president of sales, a man Julian had praised for his loyalty and who had been kept on after the acquisition. The money was being funneled through a series of shell corporations disguised as marketing consultants. The names of the corporations were bland, forgettable. But when she cross-referenced their incorporation dates, she found they were all registered by a holding company owned by Thorne's wife. It was a carefully constructed web of deceit, designed to siphon millions of dollars from the company over nearly a decade. The discovery left her feeling cold. This was not a simple mistake or a matter of creative accounting. This was a deliberate, long-term betrayal. It was exactly what had happened to Julian before. She stared at the screen, at the irrefutable lines of data that connected Marcus Thorne to the theft. Her heart ached for Julian. This news would be a devastating blow, a fresh wound laid over an old scar. She felt a tremor in her hands. She had a choice. She could write up her report, a sterile document of facts and figures, and leave it on his desk. She could detach herself emotionally, deliver the bad news with professional distance, and collect her final payment. It would be the safe thing to do, the thing that kept her carefully guarded heart out of the line of fire. Or she could do something else. She could walk into his office, not as a contractor, but as a friend, and tell him face to face. She could be there when the carefully controlled mask of the CEO inevitably cracked. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. She saved the files onto a secure flash drive, her movements precise and automatic. She walked the few steps to his office, her own heartbeat loud in her ears. His door was ajar. She could see him at his desk, head bent over a document, a pen in his hand. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For a moment, she just watched him, this man who commanded so much, yet seemed to carry the weight of it all so heavily on his shoulders. She knocked softly on the doorframe. "Julian. Can I talk to you for a minute?" He looked up, and his tired face broke into a warm smile when he saw her. "Of course, Ilara. Come in. What's on your mind?" She closed the door behind her, the soft click sealing them in. "I found something," she said, her voice quiet. "Something you need to see." She didn't hand him a report. She sat in the chair opposite his desk, plugged the flash drive into his computer, and walked him through it herself. She showed him the patterns, the shell corporations, the undeniable link to Marcus Thorne. She delivered the information calmly, factually, but her eyes never left his face. She watched as his initial curiosity hardened into disbelief, then morphed into a familiar, weary anger. He said nothing for a long time, just stared at the screen, his jaw tight, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Him too. I trusted him. I brought him into this company. I gave him a seat at the table. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. His reaction was quieter, and somehow more devastating. He leaned back in his chair and scrubbed a hand over his face, a gesture of profound exhaustion. The old Julian, the man he was before she arrived, might have retreated into a shell of cold fury. He might have called his lawyers, his security team, and handled the problem with ruthless, impersonal efficiency. But he didn't. He looked at her, his gray eyes stripped bare of all pretense, showing her the full depth of his hurt. "What do we do now?" he asked. The word "we" hung in the air between them, a fragile, powerful thing. He wasn't asking for her professional opinion as an auditor. He was asking for her help as a partner, as an ally. He was turning to her in a moment of crisis, not with orders, but with a question that invited her in completely. He was choosing to trust her, not just with his company's finances, but with his own vulnerability. In that moment, she knew she had made the right choice. She had stepped out from behind the safety of her ledgers and into the messy, complicated reality of his life. And she wasn't afraid. "We handle it," she said, her voice full of a quiet confidence she didn't know she possessed. "Together." The resolution was swift and discreet. There were no dramatic confrontations in the boardroom. Julian, guided by Ilara's meticulous documentation, worked with his legal team. Marcus Thorne was called into a meeting from which he did not return to his office. An announcement was made about his sudden resignation for personal reasons. The stolen funds, a significant portion of them, were quietly recovered. The crisis was contained, the betrayal excised with surgical precision. Through it all, Ilara was a calm, steady presence. She provided the lawyers with everything they needed, answered their questions with unassailable clarity, and then stepped back, allowing Julian to manage the fallout. She had done her job. Her contract was, for all intents and purposes, complete. A strange melancholy settled over her as she packed the few personal items she had brought to the small glass office, a photo of Leo, her favorite mug, a well-worn paperback. The space already felt anonymous again, as if she had never been there. She expected Julian to send Chloe with her final check, to offer a professional thank you and a handshake. It was the logical, corporate end to their arrangement. She braced herself for the inevitable return to her old life, a life that now seemed quieter, smaller, and a little less colorful than it had before. But Julian came himself. He found her standing by the empty desk, her small box in her hands. He didn't say anything at first, just looked around the office, then back at her. "It looks empty," he said. "It was always your office," she replied with a small smile. "I was just borrowing it." "No," he said, his gaze serious and direct. "You changed this place. You brought clarity." He took a step closer. "Ilara, what you did was more than just auditing. You found a truth I had refused to see. You navigated a crisis with a grace and strength that I have rarely encountered. I owe you more than a paycheck." "You don't owe me anything, Julian. I was just doing my job." The echo of their first conversation hung between them, but this time the context was entirely different. He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. "There you go again," he said softly. "Turning down a transaction. But this isn't a transaction. This is a thank you. A real one." He looked at her, and the carefully constructed walls between them seemed to dissolve completely. He was no longer a CEO or a client. He was just a man, grateful and humbled, looking at a woman he deeply admired. "I've had my fill of chaos," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I'm looking for something real. Something that adds up. You, Ilara Vance, you add up." Her heart, which had been bracing for a quiet goodbye, began to beat a little faster. "Have dinner with me," he said. It was not a question so much as a simple, direct statement of intent. "Not as my contractor. Not as a thank you for your work. Just, have dinner with me." She looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of obligation or pity. She found none. All she saw was a genuine, hopeful vulnerability that mirrored her own. For years, she had been so focused on surviving, on being resilient and self-sufficient, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be wanted. To be seen for exactly who she was and to have that person be enough. She thought of her quiet apartment, of the life she had so carefully built for herself and her son. It was safe. It was manageable. But it was also lonely. Julian was offering a door to something new, something that was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was a risk, but perhaps some risks were worth taking. "Yes," she said, the single word feeling momentous, a turning point. "I'd like that very much." The smile that lit up his face was worth every bit of the fear, every moment of the uncertainty. It was a smile that promised not a fairy tale ending but a real, grounded beginning. Their new reality was not a whirlwind of extravagant dates and glamorous events. It was built, instead, in a series of quiet, ordinary moments that felt more profound than any grand gesture. It was Julian, sitting on the floor of her small living room, his suit jacket slung over a chair, completely absorbed in helping Leo finish a 1,000-piece puzzle of the solar system. He wasn't trying to impress her son or play a part, he was genuinely fascinated, his sharp, analytical mind finding a different kind of satisfaction in clicking the right piece into place. He listened to Leo's detailed explanations of dwarf planets and asteroid belts with the same focused attention he gave to a corporate merger. Ilara watched them from the doorway of the kitchen, a dish towel in her hands, her heart feeling so full it might actually burst. This was the life she had never dared to dream of. Not the wealth or the status that Julian represented, but the simple, beautiful reality of a good man being kind to her child. He fit into her world so seamlessly, so naturally, it was as if a missing puzzle piece she never knew existed had finally been found. He brought groceries, he fixed the wobbly leg on her kitchen table, he read Leo bedtime stories with a surprising talent for character voices. He brought his world to her not as an intrusion, but as an offering. One Saturday, they took Leo to the Science Museum. As her son ran ahead, his face alight with wonder at the dinosaur skeletons, Julian took her hand. His grasp was warm and firm, a comfortable anchor. She looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. He was watching her, a soft, contented look in his eyes. "Happy?" he asked. "Very," she whispered, and the truth of the word was absolute. It was a quiet, sustainable happiness, not the fragile, fleeting kind. It was a happiness that had been earned, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared understanding of what it meant to be broken and to heal. It felt solid. It felt real. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. The constraints that had defined her life for so long, the debt, the loneliness, the constant, grinding worry, had begun to recede, replaced by a sense of peace and partnership. She had a new job, a permanent position as a senior analyst at Croft Enterprises, a role he had created for her, not as a favor, but because he trusted her mind and her instincts above all others. She was his colleague, his partner, his equal in every way that mattered. That evening, after Leo was asleep, they sat on her small balcony, the city lights spread out before them like a blanket of scattered jewels. It was the same view she used to clean, but now it looked different. It was no longer a symbol of a world she was excluded from. It was just a backdrop, a beautiful but ultimately unimportant part of the small, wonderful world they were building together, right here. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the fabric of his shirt soft against her cheek. She thought back to that first night, to the simple, binary choice she had faced, to leave the notebook or to return it. It seemed like a lifetime ago. A single, small decision, born of a quiet, stubborn refusal to compromise her own integrity, had unspooled her entire life and rewoven it into this new, beautiful pattern. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a rescue. It was the simple, profound consequence of being herself. She had taken a disordered, chaotic life, and piece by piece, she had put it back together, creating a picture more wonderful than she had ever imagined. She was still working on it, but now, she was not working alone.